This is Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing. I'm Rachel Gordon. Here we aim to make the process of writing and publishing a bit more transparent and a bit less overwhelming. Through conversations with editors and academics at all stages, from full professors to graduate students, independent scholars, and postdocs, we share stories, lessons, and helpful habits from our writing lives. We're really excited today to get to be speaking with John Warner, who is a writer, speaker, researcher, and consultant. He's the former editor of McSweeney's Internet Tendency and the author of a few books, including his most recent, More Than Words, How to Think About Writing in the Age of AI. And that's the one that we wanted to speak with you about today, John. For listeners who aren't quite sure, even though there's been a lot of buzz around this topic, can you explain what ChatGPT is and how and why it's connected to writing?
Sure. So ChatGPT is an example of a large language model, which falls under an even broader heading called generative AI. And you might have seen image generators or video generators or music generators, or now there's podcast generators that work off of large language models and use generative AI. And it is the way I describe it in the book and when people ask is it's an automatic syntax generator. So you prompt it with a request saying, I would like you to generate some syntax around this request, summarize an article or a book or something like that. And then it goes and fetches that information and delivers a string of text, often quite quickly, that is responsive to that through a highly sophisticated algorithmic process using the GPT, the generative pre-trained transformer, which is just a kind of breakthrough in machine learning that allows it to bring the syntax together in a way that has extremely high English or other language fluency. So it is one of the images I keep in my mind when I think about it is it's like a very eager puppy that likes to fetch. So whatever you send and say fetch, it goes and fetches that and brings it back to you as quickly as it can based on its algorithmic programming, which is really a series of probabilities around English syntax.
Great, thank you. So the book More Than Words, one of its main arguments seems to be that there's still a place for the kind of writing that we all do, that AI is not going to replace our writing. As you write about AI and the difference between how AI writes and how we write, you explain that many students have been denied the deep pleasures of writing, by which we come to know our own mind, as you explain. And many writers say this, that they write to know what they're thinking, and it's only through writing that they really figure out what their argument is or what the whole point was. But I can imagine students might reply to that kind of argument and say, well, there are other ways I can get to know my own mind. If I'm talking to a friend, if I'm debating, that helps me refine and get to the point. Why should I choose this method of writing?
So one of my sort of mantras around writing is that writing is thinking. Now, it's not the only way we think. It's not the only method of thinking, but it's an excellent way of thinking. And I think one of the difficulties students have had, and that I experienced as a teacher of first-year college writing for many years, is that they were denied the opportunity to, particularly in school, experience writing as thinking and feeling and communicating and all the things writing is, because we trained them to do what I call writing-related simulations, which other people call the 5-paragraph essay, which was the subject of a previous book, Why They Can't Write, Killing the 5-Paragraph Essay and Other Necessities. So what I witnessed in my students coming into my first-year college writing class was not so much that they had a deficiency of skills in terms of writing, but that their attitudes around writing were disconnected from the kinds of experiences that I think writing can and should deliver, right? So a lot of my work in the first year writing course was to introduce them, to at least allow them the chance to experience what it means to think through writing, to feel through writing, to communicate through writing to genuine audiences with real stakes, where the students have an opportunity to demonstrate what I call their unique intelligences to the world. That's something, again, that's not necessarily unique to writing, but writing is an excellent way to do it. And when we think about a large language model, it is the opposite of unique intelligence. It's truly a collective averaging of what's in its training set. So while we may be able to prompt it and massage it into something that's unique, that's never going to be the byproduct of a reflective thought process that happens when we write. Writing is thinking on two levels. One is we're trying to capture an idea and put it on the page. We have this notion that we're trying to crystallize and make real to an audience. But at the same time, while we write and we're thinking, the idea that we think we were capturing changes. And I think anybody who has experienced writing has had this. You have a sort of light bulb moment for your own experience of writing. That's what I want students to experience so that when they come to a writing related task, they can then decide, do I need to write this? Or is there some other alternative that will be more appropriate for whatever the needs are for the situation? But if they don't have that fundamental background in being able to write, writing is thinking, writing is feeling, writing is communicating, and the focus is entirely on the end product, and we just allow a sort of automated process to stand in for the human process, then I think we're going to wind up with in a pretty bad place around students' sense of agency, sense of their own abilities, and critical thinking.
Related to what you're saying, I'm reminded one of our listeners who's a professor. This is someone I mentioned that I was going to be talking to you to, and she brought up. She was saying, "Oh, this is a topic I'm really thinking about," and she was saying, for her, she wanted to communicate to students that writing is one of the main ways she really gets to know a student. I think those of us who teach at any
Mhm.
level have had that experience where something comes out in the writing, the kind of metaphor they use, the little example they give, their choice of a word that seems really surprising and vivid. We get a feel for the students in ways that I think are hard to do otherwise, especially when you have a lot of students. So that can be the case in all sorts of contexts that you can become known to many people. I'm thinking even of, say, internet dating, which was, a thing when I was single. The way some people, if they were able to write well,
Mhm.
could convey the sense of themselves that made the other person think, oh wow, that person seems really interesting, and they think in a kind of appealing way. Not to mention when you're applying for jobs, and that brief cover letter can still convey that kind of unique intelligence.
Mhm.
So I guess I wonder if those examples are ways we can remind students about the value of our own ability to write.
Absolutely. I mean, for sure, like to the extent that I get to have a career as a writer, it's 100% a byproduct of being, for better or worse, me in my writing. That I have whatever particular sensibilities and thoughts about the world, and then I can convey them to the world in a way that gets across a particular voice and point of view. I think the challenge that students experience in school is those things are often not valued in the classroom, and that really the writing simulation or a highly prescriptive process like a 5 paragraph essay where you're sort of dictated in not just form, but sometimes even in content, like the words you can use for a transition, or you need to start the last paragraph with in conclusion. When we value those things, when we value sort of simulation that is designed to pass muster on what is deep down, or when it all comes to it, a very surface level assessment of the quality of expression and thought, students come into like my first year writing class, and I'm talking about how we're going to really dig in and mine ourselves and our thoughts and our ideas about the world, and it's confusing because that's not what has been prized in terms of success. And so with the existence of this technology, this syntax automation process that can satisfy those surface level indicators around what students are expected to generate for credit in school, I think one of the most important things we have to do is rethink the kinds of criteria that we use in our own assessment, as well as concentrating on assessing not just that end product, but the process that went into it, and requiring students to be thoughtful and reflective and knowledgeable of their own process that went into it, where they understand what they've done and what they've learned. I I use in my courses for many years, for more than a decade. I used two reflection questions at the end of just about any writing assignment. One was, what do you know now that you didn't know before? And that could be subject matter or whatever they wrote about. But it could also be like writing process or their own writing knowledge. And then I would ask, what can you do now that you couldn't do before? And really saying, okay, what capabilities do you have? And what I want them students reflecting on there is what capacities are they building? What do they have ownership of? What do they now have that something else can be built on? And if instead they're just plugging prompts into ChatGPT or some other large language model and spitting it out for credit, which we know to some degree is happening in our classrooms, they're literally not learning anything, and why? Because they're not having the experiences that allow them to learn.
Something you said earlier was about figuring out when we should use AI and when not to, which I guess provides a hint that you might be someone who feels like there is a place for for AI and that it can be a kind of ally or help to our writing. Can you give us some examples of that?
Well, I'll be very transparent. I was much more enthusiastic about the potential of this technology to help my work when I started the process of writing this book than I was at the end or that I am now. And to the extent that I played around with these things a lot, I discovered it was useful in that I discovered a lot about how I work, right? And now I'm 54 years old. I have a very long-standing, developed, entirely idiosyncratic writing process, right? As many of us do. Most of our processes are idiosyncratic in some way. And I thought that I could integrate this stuff into my work somehow, but what I found is not as much as I thought. If My general advice is if the end product, the quality of the end product will benefit from some thought and your experience of it, you should not outsource it to a large language model. And this is why I'm very cautious about students using it because they don't have my ingrained process. They don't have that experience to determine these things. On the other hand, if the end product is really just a distillation of existing knowledge or information, and no additional thought needs to go in or no additional shaping of either the content or its form, then I think it's a can be a very useful tool. I mean, the for lack of a better word, like it's very helpful at dealing with some of the BS writing that we have to do in our lives. Like if I still had a faculty position and I had to do my annual activity report, that would go up the ladder to a dean or a provost that really just repeats whatever is on my CV in a kind of quasi-narrative form, I would turn a large language model loose on that thing in a heartbeat and proofread it once and send it along. So, the notion that we are can or should use this stuff really, I think, is bound up with what we think we're going to be doing and benefiting from when we do the writing. And that calculation is really kind of up to the different tasks, right? One of the things I do say in the book, though, is to be careful and not ignore that there may be benefit to doing something that seems like it's kind of BS. An example I use in the book is like a recommendation letter, which often appears to be and maybe even is sort of pro forma. All we have to do is prove that we wrote a letter, that a student can get somebody to write them a letter, right? And if that's true, then maybe a little chat GPT is okay. But the chance to write a recommendation letter for a student is also a chance to reflect on who you were as a teacher when you had that student. And I found much benefit of that over the years. So it's really up to the individual. And uh, my only caution is to be vigilant over not kidding yourself that this might benefit from your thinking, right? If thinking is going to be part of the improvement of the product, then you should probably go ahead and write it.
That's interesting because it feels like in my limited use of I have found that I agree with you. It's great for like abstracts, summaries, but I do find that I even in those things, when I need to summarize my project for a application for a grant, I have sometimes tried using AI and then my tweaking it. And because I'm, I guess, expert on the subject, since it's about my project, whenever that is the case, when it's an area of your expertise, I do feel like there's thought involved then in editing AI, and it works. Like it is it gets things going.
It certainly can, right? Particularly when you're working from that position of expertise, when you can look at the AI output and immediately assess its accuracy, its fidelity to the original, and those sorts of things. And it depends on the individual. The experiments that I did with a lot of that, I realized I was spending more time editing the initial output than it would have taken me to just write the thing to begin with. As my grandfather told me many, 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 many years ago, you can't shine a turd. So if what you have is a turd, then you're not going to be able to, editing the turd is not going to
Right.
make it any better, right?
Hmm.
So the a lot of that depends on really what you're trying to make. Like something that I wouldn't hesitate to use a large language model for is if I had a sort of table of data that I needed to have a text summary of what's in the table beneath it, which is just kind of a verbatim translation of numbers into syntax. That would be great. I'm not going to worry about style. I'm not going to worry about presentation. I'm not going to worry about voice. Those are all things that just don't matter and that kind of thing. But where the idea isn't fixed, it often can be like more frustrating to work with that if from an expert place. And the challenge if you're from a non-expert place is that you can look at it and that looks pretty good, but
Right.
you don't know.
Yeah.
You don't know because you haven't worked through that particular writing problem.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's how, in a way, our conversation right now is sort of on these two levels of teaching and students, and then
Hmm.
maybe academics in our audience, how
Hmm.
we might use it. And what maybe we're trying to warn students is that y'all might not be sort of experts in the field enough to be able to pick out where it's
Hmm.
getting it wrong. And I'm just thinking of another example of where I used AI recently trying to come up with titles for a popular essay I had written, and the editor and I had both come up with some, none of which were great. And I could ask AI to come up with several. I think I recently heard someone refer to ChatGPT as like this, limitless patience kind of research assistant, or you can ask it to come up with, say, a dozen. And most were not good, but two, I thought, especially with minor tweaking, were much better than anything
Hmm.
we'd come up with. So yeah, I mean, I'm often pleasantly surprised. I guess on the other hand, I don't feel it can replace my writing, mostly because I'm wondering what you think of Chat GPT's ability to not flatten our voice, which is the complaint. I mean, other academics say this is where they
Hmm.
feel like they can pick out AI writing, is that it just feels flat.
Yeah, it's one of the things folks should sort of be aware of or recognize is so ChatGPT is not the whole of large language models. And there are some like if anybody's experimented with Claude, which comes from the company Anthropic, um, that is a much more sort of voicey large language model, and you can do prompting to it to get it to sound more less flat, more with more personality and that kind of stuff. Um, I still experience even that stuff as a kind of uncanny valley between human and human-like. Maybe I'm kidding myself, but I do think there is something about even the more sophisticated large language models that are more concerned with generating that sort of output and what a real human sounds like. Maybe I'm more sensitized to these things, right? I've been reading and writing for a good chunk of my life. These things are important to me, but I think they're important to audiences in general. Um, and that we should be aware of those things. For something like titles, yeah, like it's titles are hard. It's kind of boring to sit there and try to just brainstorm a bunch of these
Right.
things all at once. And ultimately, the selection, it is nice to have. Maybe we don't want 100. That's too many because then we get lost in the weeds. But if we have 15, to see these different things and one might spark, right? Then it is right. It is a syntax generator. The title is a combination, is really a function of a combination of words to create a syntactical string that achieves very defined goals, right? Of defining your subject and capturing reader attention. So those, if we think about it, that's a very narrow band of what that has to achieve, and our ability to garner the stuff that the large language model is producing and then kind of police its quality is that's pretty straightforward and carries very little risk of sort of a mistake versus some of the other applications of this technology that I think some folks have really embraced in ways that I think are potentially troublesome. I won't say who, but I was listening to a podcast a couple weeks ago. This person said they let ChatGPT or Claude read everything for them now and just read the summaries of what the large language model does. And I find that distressing because, again, reading is an experience. We have thoughts, we have critical thoughts while we're reading something that are not the same as reading the summary of a reading. That's a step removed from that. And so, reading is just not, it's not only taking in information. Writing is not only taking what's exactly in our brain and putting it on their page. There is something that happens in there that is very, very important. And for students, I think we need to give them as much practice at that as possible. To me, that's just the stuff of learning. That's flat out what we're supposed to be doing. For those of us who feel like we have those things already, I think we have to just be responsible with how we integrate this technology into our work so as not to compromise the work itself or our own experience of our work. That's I think that's another big part of this is where folks are like, I'm going to outsource the grading of writing of my students' writing to this stuff. It's kind of like, well, isn't your job to read your
Right.
students' writing, right? Like if reading your students' writing is not something you're prepared to do as somebody who either teaches writing or assigns writing as part of their discipline, then you are alienating yourself. You're choosing to alienate yourself from your own work. I understand the pressures of having too many students, too little time, and that kind of stuff. I lived that life as a non-tenure track instructor of first year writing. I always had too many students, but we should not allow the technology to mask that fact as a way of just sort of having a conveyor belt of students churning stuff out and our large language model grader responding to it. We will get into a sort of loop of students use ChatGPT to generate something. We use ChatGPT to grade it. And then really is what are we doing? Why are we here if that's what we're gonna if that's the activities of education?
I've heard some refer to AI or Chat GPT as equalizing forces in that, especially if we're thinking of academics, not everyone has the funds to hire, say, a developmental editor. And it seems like you can give ChatGPT a prompt that sort of says, oh, you are a developmental editor. How would you, make this essay or this introduction more whatever? Um, what do you think of that?
Uh, It's not for me,
Mm-hmm.
but I am hesitant to cast an absolute judgment. If somebody who has a thoughtful, purposeful approach to their own writing can find prompts that they believe help them develop their work in a genuine, thoughtful way, I wouldn't say no, you shouldn't do it. But again, my cautions are um, ultimately, and again, some of this gets down to your value system, right? Like deep down, I see all writing is fundamentally communicative, right? We're writing to um, yes, to know our own minds, but ultimately to share these ideas with the world. We are part of a big academic conversation, and that conversation is among people. And large language models are not part of that conversation because they have no stake, they have no interest, they have no sort of mind or body or experience that um, has any impact on them. They are simply a syntax generating machine. And so if we're going to outsource developmental editing to a large language model, can we say, well, I don't have access to a developmental editor? Well, um, maybe we should work to give people more access to people who can help them edit or who will read their work and that sort of stuff. So in the same way that I would hate to see this technology paper over real world issues in the classroom, like having too many students and not enough time to respond to their writing, I'd hate to see it also be used in the research and publishing work of academics where they could use additional time, support, resources, or maybe different metrics around what counts, right? I think researchers can use this to generate many more words and more things that could potentially be published. But what is the point of that if it's not the product of the mind of the scholar, the academic? And those are the things we have to think about as individuals, but also collectively, right? This is not something that every individual can make a choice and will wind up in a good place. We have to establish a sort of community of norms, which may have a range of behaviors, expectations, which are tied into actual meaningful work, right? This is what I keep coming back to in my thinking about this is like, we have to live. Large language models just sit there waiting to be prompted. They are not human. They don't have experiences of the world. And so if we only use this technology to crank out more stuff and ratchet up the bars of what achievement looks like and make the treadmill go faster, why are we introducing this technology for that? That doesn't help uh, with any kind of human flourishing. And if education cannot be concerned with human flourishing, I'm not sure what purpose does education have if not that, right? Like I understand all the other parts of credentialing and certification and that, but ultimately I'm sort of maybe I'm a romantic. I believe in that mission. I believe education makes us and those around us happier, better, smarter, whatever. And that if we're going to use this technology, that's how we should be using it. Not just more productive, not just more efficient. Those are not educational values.
Right. I mean, and I guess your reminder of, we have to live. It's a quality of life thing, as you're saying. If I'm, denying myself the pleasures of reading or writing something to a friend or a friend receiving something they can tell really comes, written from me, a lot of the joy in life is taken out. Some will wonder if our students are going to use ChatGPT anyway in their writing, or some are. Are there ways to make our assignments have them do that more transparently, or maybe without kind of shame or trying to sneak this? I
Mhm.
have one colleague who I think asks for the transcript. And that way, he can sort of, I suppose, applaud a student who's really edited or, decided really not to use or, how to make use of what ChatGPT did.
Yeah, I think transparency is key. I think it's key anyway. Transparency is sort of one of the pillars of my own sort of pedagogical philosophy, right? Students should know why we're doing what we're doing. And it needs to go beyond you're doing it because you're a college student and this is the assignment I gave you. Like there is an underlying purpose to this stuff that should be a clear and present rationale while the student is doing it so that they know how their own efforts should be oriented. And so if a student is going to utilize this, yes, they kind of have to show their work, right? And you know, as a writing teacher, particular first year writing, the proof of process is as important as the product for my students when I was teaching. Um, but I also want students to be able to reflect on their own process when it's all said and done. So if they're going to make use of ChatGPT and they're in developing this end product, I want them to still be able to answer those reflection questions of what can you do now you couldn't do before? What do you know now that you didn't know before? And if the answers to those are what can you do now that you couldn't do before is nothing or not much, because so much was done by the large language model. And what do you know now that you didn't know before is nothing or not much. Then ultimately, we have to have a conversation with the student or think about the design of the course or the assignment that gets them so they're going to have an actual learning experience, right? So a learning experience can certainly happen with large language models present, but their presence makes it much easier to do an end run around learning experience. Now, it's not like students avoiding learning is anything new, right? Like you know, I graduated college in 1992, and I could have told you the thousands of ways I avoided learning, including by like just never going to class and cramming for tests and forgetting everything afterwards. Those are all the same underlying motive to outsourcing something to a large language model. The challenge is we have this technology that can give a passable product with no student learning happening. And as long as that's there, and we probably can't police it, we probably can't prevent it, that we can't really detect it beyond sort of suspicions, that kind of stuff. I think the only way to approach it is through transparency and to um, do our best to appeal to students' own self-interest around learning stuff. My uh, I'm pretty I'm the opposite of cynical when it comes to students. I'm a cynical person in general, but my assumption about students is that they genuinely want to learn stuff. They're young, they're human, they're curious. They also often have come into college with an experience of secondary education that does not seem interested in them actually learning stuff. They've been doing these performances to check a box and move into the next thing. They've been in a system, I call it a system of indefinite future reward. The only reason to do this is because something's going to pay off in the future. If instead we can create a learning experience that has intrinsic interest in the present, where students can build their sense of agency and self-empowerment and accruing that kind of knowledge and skills, we stand a decent chance of engaging them. It's no guarantee. It's not going to happen with every student every time. We can't expect to defy human nature, but we can give ourselves the best possible chance to succeed in those cases. I think in teaching for a long time and now talking with many students about these issues, both for the book and ongoing conversations, they're ready to be engaged. They might be a little bit distrustful that school is going to do that, but it's not impossible, particularly if you are transparent and you are forthright about the kinds of things you want them to learn and to experience.
Yeah, I guess I often wonder if the happiness argument can be added to that. Sort of what we were talking about before about these deep joys of sort of expressing yourself, being known to others. Unfortunately, I feel like writing has this reputation of being really hard and miserable because those of us who write just like to complain about it. But we do it because it's also really fun and all those good things. But we don't seem
This,
to talk about those as
yeah,
much.
a few weeks ago, or maybe a couple months ago, I did a for my Inside Higher Ed blog. I did a post titled something like uh, "Writing is fun, um, even when it's hard, especially because it's hard, right?" And yes, we do complain. Like the act of writing is essentially frustration and falling short, right? Like in your mind is just the greatest expression that you could imagine, and the idea is perfect, and something happens between your brain and the page where it's not quite as powerful. But even that sense of, the cliche of, oh, I don't like writing, but I love having written, that is a form of pleasure in and of itself, right? This the sense of accomplishment and achievement. And those are meaningful things to students. I think one of the chief disappointments, the students that I've worked with and talked to about school, is that they often don't feel like they've achieved anything meaningful, particularly in a world where grades to them are extremely valuable in terms of transaction, but generally meaningless in terms of accomplishment. And so, if we can give them that sense of accomplishment around writing, I think it's actually not all that hard to get them
Mm-hmm.
engaged in doing it. Particularly, I would use to my advantage the fact that they had had generally uninspiring experiences with writing before they got in my class, because I could show them there's a different way of going about this. And again, it's a very small shift. I changed over the many years I taught. I started with a highly prescriptive um, teaching style that was about coaching students to the best possible grade on the assignment we're doing at the time, because I thought that was my job. That was essentially how I had been inculcated into the teaching profession as a TA and then a young instructor. And I realized at some point along the way that what I was doing in my life as a writer and how I was teaching writing to students were two totally different things. That the behaviors I engaged with as a writer were nothing like how I was coaching students to write things as a teacher. And so then I just spent a number of years experimenting to bring those two things into alignment, which resulted in this framework I use, which is called the writer's practice, which is the title of one of my other books, the skills, knowledge, attitudes, and habits of mind of writers. That's what we're going to learn in my writing courses, regardless of if it's first year writing, technical writing, creative writing, humor writing, what have you. And if I can get students alerted to those things and thinking about those things, every writing experience we do is going to build those capacities in some way. Even if the end artifact they produced in a particular experience is like, it's not great,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it's unfamiliar or they're struggling or they're learning, they can still, in reflection, articulate to me the habits, skills, attitudes, uh, habits of mind, skills, knowledge, and attitudes that they're building in their writer's practice. And over time, they're going to increase these capacities. And then when they're done with my 15 or 16-week course, they have this thing, their practice, that they can apply to a future occasion, which is what, again, I learned far too late. Somebody should have told me this when I was studying, when I was getting my multiple English and writing degrees, that I had these abilities. But when I finished graduate school and I took a job in corporate America in market research, and I realized that the same skills that allowed me to do a poetry explication of a Gerard Manley Hopkins sonnet worked to write a focus group report about a new flavor of Ben and Jerry's ice cream. They're the exact same skills. And nobody told me. I had to figure it out for myself. So my goal now with students or teachers of writing is to help students know they are building these capacities in a meaningful and enduring way. And it's important to have those capacities independent of a large language model. Any professional person who is using this technology productively to do their own work has a whole host of knowledge, skills, attitudes, habits of mind. They have a practice that allows them to use this technology. If you introduce this technology in the absence of an established practice, I think you're asking for not great stuff. I think the technology is significantly less useful under those circumstances.
And the idea of the writer's practice is also a part of this most recent book, More Than Words. You explain. So, for our listeners, can you give us a, you just did this in part, but a sort of quick sense of why feeling like you have a practice or have developed it is worthwhile?
Yeah, so some of it is breaking down the parts, right? The skills, knowledge, attitudes, and habits of mind. So the skills of writing, things like brainstorming, drafting, editing, proofreading, et cetera, they're helpful at a very basic level, right? Like I can put words on a page and I can make lines accrue. I'm a typer. I can't handwrite, so I can do that. Knowledge of writing, like knowledge of writing process, but also knowledge of the world, we see as having something to write about, right? Like I publish in a given week 3 or 4 new pieces of writing for various outlets, and I was doing a podcast recently, and they said, "Well, do you ever have writer's block?" And I said, I'm always blocked on something. I'm never blocked on everything. So there's always something I can do. That's a kind of skill, but it's also knowledge and an attitude and habit of mind fixed together. And once we adopt attitudes like a kind of exactness over a work or a pride, right, in our expression, we begin to direct a more acute sense of attention to our own work. That is hard, taxing, but also deeply pleasurable, right? Like with the process of like writing a book. Drafting is awesome. It's like this, here's I'm just gonna fire these thoughts onto the page. And then the editing and revision and editing is less pleasurable. And the final, like, now we're really going over it, right? You have all the proofreaders' comments and these things. This approaches tedium, but amidst that tedium is moments where it's like you just changed one word in a sentence and you appreciate, like, oh, I just nailed that sentence. It was okay before, it was good enough, and now it can't be better. And one of the attitudes and habits of mind I want students to learn, and this is true of writing, it's kind of true about anything, is there's a threshold of good enough. And most of life we can get by with good enough, right? But then there is this world of can't be better. And there are times where our life or our work or our spirits call us to do something at the can't be better level. And if I can get my student just once in the semester, like one of my learning goals for my students that I put in I pre-register my goals for my students right before a semester is that they have a can't be better moment themselves. And it may be as short as a sentence. It may just be like it's like the one perfect sentence in this thing. But as soon as they've experienced that, they know what it looks like. And it's something that they can take with them in the same way that what's another? Oh, flow. Having a moment of flow is one of the learning goals I have for students in my writing courses. Because as soon as, I'm sure you've lost sense of time while you're working, right?
Mm-hmm.
As soon as they have that, they're
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, that's what concentration feels like. I can do that, right? And I think it's especially important for students of a generation that has not gotten as much practice with this before all the distracting technology of the world showed up. And I can be as prone to giving into that stuff as anybody, but I have this reservoir of experience that allows me to work from it. So those things are just I think they're not just meaningful in the academic sense. I mean I joke, and it's in my first year writing syllabus. I just wrote another blog post about this. Like I would tell my students, like, this course is the key to your ultimate fulfillment and happiness,
Mm.
because you will come to know your own you'll have control over your own mind
Hmm.
and thoughts and beliefs, and you'll be able to communicate those ideas to others.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an inoculation against bad things happening to you, but it's a way of engaging with the world from a place of empowerment, as opposed to sort of a helplessness and lack of understanding of what's going on around you.
To think about the faculty side for just a moment, at least among humanities academics, I was talking to, some colleagues in preparation for our conversation just to get a feel, and it seems like a lot of us humanities professors do not use AI a ton, and I almost feel like I'm very proud of like the 5 times I remember to use it, but it's not natural to me. And after the fact of having done certain tasks, I'm like, oh, that probably was something where that might have been interesting to see what AI could do. So I'm wondering if you have any advice for our, since we're mostly humanities academics among our listeners, for when we might think about trying it to see if this feels like a helpful ally.
It, uh, uh, so when I found it useful, I found it occasionally useful as a check of my memory, where I've read a particular book or article, and I remember certain things about it, but I don't want to read the whole thing again. And so I'll go to a large language model, and you can sort of prompt it like, I'm going to ask you to access only information that's in this particular text. And I want you to summarize certain things element, or I want you to pull out certain themes or this kind of stuff. And it becomes that sort of like what Ethan Mollick, who's a big AI guy, would call a co-intelligence in that sense, that it's there because my memory is imperfect and I don't have the capacity to remember all this stuff, but that I do have, again, sufficient pre-knowledge and expertise to know if it's going to feed me something that is not correct. So I think it's useful that way. So, referencing what I said earlier, I think it's a lousy thing to do if you're reading something the first time to ask it to summarize it. But if you have something that you just can't quite get, it's helpful that way. I think it is, while it has a lot of problems as a search engine because of its predilection for making stuff up for hallucinations, it still has some utility as a search engine where you kind of need something, but you're not quite sure what it is. And I've used it several times to help me surface like books where I just can't remember the title or the author or something, like a book about X, Y, and Z, female author published in the 90s. And it over time, with enough additional prompts, and sometimes even with very few prompts, it calls that up for me. That's fantastic, particularly as like Google search has been increasingly degraded in terms of its usefulness and quality. Those are all good. Those are all useful time savers. I just did. Here's something I did. I sent out an email about my forthcoming book to my personal contacts, and because I'm not an organized person, I don't have like a nice address book in my email program. So I just went through all my old emails and I compiled the people that I wanted to send it to as I went through my emails. This was a non-alphabetized list in Microsoft Word. I put that into ChatGPT. I said, one column is the first name, the second column is the second name. I want you to alphabetize this by last name while keeping the first name first, like that.
Oh, that's
It couldn't have,
perfect. Yeah.
it was a absolutely tedious task that I was dreading, and almost I had to send it to my book publicist. So I was like, oh God, I'm just going to send it to her unorganized and let her figure it out. But I'm like, no, do it for that. So it's very handy with that kind of stuff, but it can't think. It doesn't really reason. There are some models that use this idea of chain of thought that simulates a kind of reasoning, but it's not how we do it. It's not human reasoning. It's a simulation. Um, so it's there. It's not useless. It's not fake. It's not all BS. And in fact, there's some folks doing some very interesting things around its ability to sort of accurately identify misinformation and this kind of stuff, because it has capacities for, it's a big pattern recognition device. So if you're looking for, if you want to identify things that are deviants from a pattern because they are fake, it can be quite useful for that. So I'm a big fan of experimenting with this stuff. But it must be controlled experiments, and there has to be a purpose to it. There has to be an objective. There has to be a reason you're turning to it. Otherwise, it's very easy to sort of get lost in the illusion of intelligence, or to become enamored with the increased speed and efficiency of output, which I think if speed and efficiency become our primary values in education, again, I think we're asking for trouble. They already are in a lot of senses, and I think we're worse off for it. So if we kind of double down on that, it's only even worse.
There's two questions that we ask all guests, and one is if there's something you wish you had known about writing or publishing earlier in your career. And, when I was reading about you earlier, before we invited you, it seems like you've had such a really interesting writing path that there's probably all sorts of things you've discovered along the way because you've published, I think in many different kinds of forms.
Yeah, my very first book, co-authored with my friend Kevin Guilfoyle, was done primarily in colored pencil and was a satire of President George W. Bush called My First Presidentiary. So yes, and now I'm writing for like academic publishers and this kind of stuff. So yeah, I've done a lot of different things. The thing really I wish I had known at the beginning is kind of what I was saying earlier, is that these different forms of writing have much more in common than they are different. Um, I've written humor and satire. I've written market research reports. I've ghostwritten a couple of business books back when I sort of needed that sort of money. I've written a bunch of different books about different things. I've written hundreds and hundreds of blog posts for Inside Higher Ed. I've been a columnist for the Chicago Tribune for over a decade. These things, I've published a novel, short stories, essays, all this stuff. It's all much more similar than it is different. So there was a time when I was like in graduate school studying fiction writing where I would have thought that the writer's job is to sort of court the muse, right? You've got to go find the inspiration, and this mystical process is going to result in some hopefully some output of genius. But it really, that's not true. You you sit down and you write, and you try to be thoughtful in the way that the thing you're writing demands you be thoughtful. And sometimes that means sort of allowing your imagination to drift and free associate. And sometimes that means reading a bunch of stuff where you're going to try to combine insights from different sources. Sometimes that means going into your own past and trying to find something meaningful about what you've experienced. In the end, these are all they're all very, very similar. And anybody who writes anything is capable of doing any other thing. With practice, it doesn't come easy. When I started blogging for Inside Higher Ed back in 2011 or 2012, it would take me a week to write like a blog post. And now it takes me a couple of hours. Now there's a bunch of thinking that happens before then, and often a bunch of reading. But once I sit down to do it, it's like there it comes. So that's practice, and that's useful. But the ability to do it was in there the whole time. All it took was the actual opportunity to do it, which is why I encourage a lot of academics are hesitant to start working in a mode that is not familiar to them because they're so proficient in the thing they are. And I'm always encouraging them to try something they haven't tried before. And it will likely they'll enjoy the new thing, and it will shed fresh light on the thing they're already expert in.
That's great to hear, especially because I know we've spoken to guests and have heard from listeners who are academics and who are thinking about fiction or other creative forms. And since you're someone who has done both, well, it's interesting to hear that you think there is some real connection there.
Writing is writing. I mean, really, it's like it's coming from you. You have an audience, you have a purpose, you have a vision, and the goal is to put that on the page. And I think the hard part academics struggle with, um, I never struggled this because I was never a proper academic, but I think academics being so accomplished in this one thing sometimes struggle with being a novice in something else. And I think it's just a matter of sort of embracing the challenge of one's novicehood. While I was writing, while I was writing this book, I was also taking drum lessons and playing the drums. I'd been a self-taught drummer 25 years ago and then had not played for many, many years. I started taking lessons at the School of Rock near where I live. And it made me realize, and I was just having great fun being the sort of beginner again. And it made me appreciate more the thing I was expert in, writing this book. And so I think being able to do those activities simultaneously, the thing I'm novice at and the thing I'm expert in, benefits both activities.
Mm. The other question we ask folks is whether there is a writing practice or habit that has been working for you.
Uh, what works for me is working on a lot of different things simultaneously. Now, a lot of that is by necessity, just because the way I sort of make my living is to have these different outlets that I publish for every week. But even in the midst of those deadlines still existing, I was able to write this book over the span of 6 or so months. So it's not like it precludes those activities, but the energy of knowing that there's something that I can get to and that will be productive has been very, very helpful for me, as opposed to how I often used to operate, which was to wait around for the inspiration, right? Like I'm going to wait until I'm just ready. It's going to build up and then I'm going to go, 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 go. That resulted in a writing practice that was, I still remember I wrote my novel. It took me 8 years and 1 month to write the novel. It took me 8 years to write half of it and a month to write the second half, right? That's a lousy practice. If you can keep the energy stoked in some way and then be able to move from thing to thing while keeping them together, that works great for me. It's not for everybody, but I recommend folks try it, particularly if they're prone to overthinking or block or um, worrying too much about one thing. I can be a worrier by nature, so it's just I give myself too many things to be able to worry about any single one thing. So I have to, it's like, all right, that's got to get done today. Let's get it done. And then it gets done and you feel good and you're like, oh, there's this other thing that I can do too. Um, it's training myself to not be precious about being inspired or feeling good or whatever has been kind of the best thing I've trained myself to do over the years.
I find the same thing. To me, it's related to the fact that I'm also kind of a list person. So I have then the opportunity to get to check off more than one thing on the list, even though it is probably the case that on one of those writing projects, I've only worked on a paragraph of it. But who's to say that, back in the day when I didn't do multiple things, sometimes I would just spend hours and it would just be one paragraph anyway. So,
Yeah, that could be you sort of flog the idea for hours and then you look at the cursor blinking on your
right.
page and then you do like that's no improvement
Yeah.
over I did 3 things today and only got a paragraph on this, but these other things. That's and that's not even it's not the productivity that I'm celebrating. It's the engagement, right?
Mm,
It's my mind is on this rather than sort of in a sort of doom loop over what you think you should be doing. That's not productive. Doing overthinking what you should be doing is it, if nothing else, it's a better way to go through life.
yeah. Well, thank you so much, John. This has been really fun and interesting for us.
That was great for me. I appreciate you having me.
Thanks for listening to Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Visit our podcast description to find out how to contact us and send us your questions about academic writing and publishing. Follow us on social media at Writing It Pod and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode.